Hi guys, welcome back to another episode of Togainu no Chi, however you pronounce it. Last time we learned about Akira and that he was part of some Japanese government program in which children were randomly given to random people to take care of them. Which made no sense. It wasn't really explained, but if that's just a taste of the excellent world building this game has to offer, ooh, I'm excited. This may even rival Dramatical Murder's world building, which was a nightmare. Alright, anyway, we're about to get gang-arred by these officers, so let's see what happens. Two men in black uniforms. They weren't from Blaster. The one gripping Akira by the hair looked high-strung with slick black hair and a thin face. The one standing behind him was well-built. Both were wearing white gloves and had clubs strapped to their waists. Cops. Seeing Akira's glare, the thin-faced officer let out a snort of laughter. Oh, oops, I skipped through his line a little. Without letting go of Akira's hair, the man punched him hard in the face. Thought you were supposed to be a good fighter, Akira. Come on. He had no idea. Murder? He looked at the well-built officer. Though the post-war chaos had begun to calm down at last, the system was still full of holes. False arrests were hardly unusual. The thin-faced officer's temples twitched. He tried to shake free, but the man only gripped tighter. Narrow eyebrows rising, the thin-faced... Jesus. That line kept going. Narrow eyebrows rising, the thin-faced policeman contorted his lips in a sneer. You seem to be taking too much pleasure in this. If they knew his alias, it also meant that they knew his reputation on the streets. He doubted they had a positive image of Blaster. Knowing he was the champion, they probably thought he was some kind of psycho. Akira snapped his voice low. The thin-faced officer grabbed him hard by the jaw and jerked their faces together. His eyes were full of contempt. With that, he released Akira's hair and stepped away. Immediately, the well-built officer seized both of Akira's arms, then dragged him out of bed and pinned his hands behind him. Oh my god. As Akira attempted to shake him off, the thin-faced officer clubbed him in the back. It was a merciless blow, knocking the breath from his lungs. Grinning, the thin-faced officer leaned forward and tapped Akira on the side of the face with the end of his club. The officer behind him hauled him to his feet and marched him through the front door. Even more than the false accusation, it was their attitude that infuriated him. They probably hadn't performed a real investigation. He didn't normally give a damn how this country was run, but that didn't mean he was about to let these cops walk all over him. Then why didn't you just kick their asses? As soon as Akira was through the door, he heard a familiar voice. Turning, he saw a friendly face, eyes and mouth agape. The only thing I remember from the anime is that he is a major simp for Akira. That's what I remember. It was Keisuke, frozen in place with his hands stretched towards the doorknob. His coveralls were so stained with black that it was hard to make out the original color. The thin-faced policeman shoved him aside with his club.
おい、ちょっと待てよ。
Coming back to himself as he staggered, Keisuke laid a frantic hand on the shoulder of the officer restraining Akira. The officer flung him back with so much force, Keisuke staggered again. For a second he looked shocked, but then his anger flared.
待てって言ってんだろ。アキラが何したんだよ。
うるさい。お前も公務執行妨害で逮捕するぞ。
やろう。
Keisuke dove at them, but the well-built officers shouldered him away.
アキラ。
The power of the blow was too much. Keisuke collapsed with a groan.
ほら、歩け。
Akira looked over his shoulder as they dragged him along. Keisuke was watching him, face screwed up in pain. Even after the officers forced him to face forward again, Akira could sense Keisuke's eyes staring helplessly at his back. Well, there's more simping where that came from. The cheap rusted steel desk rattled beneath the detective's hand. In the light of the desk lamp, his face looked like a well-carved totem pole. His scowl was so fierce that his eyes seemed to about pop out of their sockets.
いい加減白状したらどうなんだ。
Okay. He had been repeating the same phrases in his aging bellow for quite some time now. Akira leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling. He wondered if the man would ever get bored.
人の話聞いてんのか、このコンコンチキが。
警部、血圧上がりますから、
Why
落ち着
did
い
they
て。
just suddenly change art styles? The timid-looking detective taking notes nearby made a tentative effort to calm the older man down. His gaunt features and pale complexion made him look like a walking corpse.
そうだな。少し落ち着こう。君、カツ丼でも食うか。
The detective asked Akira in a somewhat more restrained tone of voice, wiping the sweat from his forehead with a wrinkled handkerchief. Akira didn't reply, of course. From the beginning, he hadn't responded to any of their questions. Ultimately, he was here as a material witness, since they hadn't pinned him down definitively as the perpetrator. But that didn't change the fact that his interview was meant to extract a confession, and that there was no way he was going to confess to something he hadn't done. The inspector's face flushed red, contorting more and more as the silence continued. Eventually he began quivering, all but letting out a snarl before losing his patience for the umpteenth time.
カツ丼どころじゃないわ。いいから白状しろ、しろ。
警部。
それをよくし。
The inspector snatched the documents from the timid detective and licked his fingers, then flipped through the pages. He raised his eyebrows.
国民番号 11298TM3099 無職家族構成は父母のみ3年同居の後に別居ブラスター個人戦優勝経験あり別居ね鬼ババだったとかならともかく優しくていいご夫婦だったそうじゃないか
The distant memory of his foster parents surfaced in the back of his mind. They had indeed been kind. He considered himself lucky. But in the end, they were just strangers. They shared no ties of blood. The detective leaned forward, nose almost touching the papers, and glared up at Akira.
犯行推定時刻は午前3時頃。害者の死因は全身打撲による外傷性ショック死。アリバイなし。現場から半径200メートル以内にいた。しかもブラスターの常連ときたら。
The inspector slammed the papers out on the desk.
お前らに考えられたのか
How did being a blaster fighter automatically make him the culprit? He could understand them having a bad impression of him, but that didn't give them the right to label him a criminal.
やってない。
嘘つけお前がやったそうだな
When Akira stared back silently, the detective sucked in a sharp breath and pointed at him.
瞬きをした今お前は瞬きをしたな黙っていても目は口ほどに物を言うはい私がやりましたと
Akira was beginning to care less and less about where this was headed. If the state was this determined to pin the crime on him, there wasn't much he could do.
とにかく返すわけにはいかんおい連れてき
The inspector spat the words with a reddened face. He slammed the steel desk again, hard enough to leave a dent. Taking that as their cue, the two policemen entered and took Akira's arms. They were the same officers who had arrested him earlier.
さて快適なお部屋へご案内だ。お前が住んでたボロい犬小屋より居心地はマシだろうよ。
The thin-faced officer sneered, his voice slimy in Akira's ear. Spurred by revulsion, Akira spat at his cheek. His entire face twitching with rage, the officer wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. Akira laughed scornfully.
だったらあんたが入ればいいだろう。
狂犬が
The second they yanked him out of the interrogation room, the well-built officer pulled Akira's arms together behind him. The other officer unhooked his club. Akira braced himself for what was coming.
ほらさっきの勢いはどうした
The dull thwack of his club echoed down the dimly lit corridor. Grimacing, Akira squeezed his eyes shut and endured it without making a sound. If he let so much as a single groan, he'd be giving them exactly what they wanted.
泣けよ泣きわめけよ
Harder blows rained down on them as they hurled him back against the wall. He caught a glimpse of the thin-faced officer grinning, his eyes wide with sadistic joy. Who was the mad dog here exactly? This whole country was rotten beyond redemption. How was anyone supposed to believe in a brighter future? They were long past the point of no return. The beating continued, but the more it hurt, the more determined Akira became to give these scumbags nothing. How much time had passed since they put him in this cell? They beaten him from head to toe. A dull ache filled every inch of his body. Without a doubt, this jail was the whitest building Akira had ever seen. Everything was white, from walls and the ceiling to the floors and the bed sheets. The bed sheets, or at least the blanket isn't white, I guess. There are no bed sheets, it's just a mattress. Whatever. Strangely, it made the place seem dim and eerie, even though the facility was lit by so many fluorescent lights that he could barely open his eyes. Occasionally he heard freakish moans or off-key humming in the distance. If anything, it felt more like a hospital psych ward than a place to house criminals. And in fact, that precisely was what it was. Several years ago, due to a rise in crimes related to mental illness, juvenile crimes foremost among them, the government decided that all criminal behavior was indicative of underlying psychological pathology. Thus, prisons became institutions providing psychiatric treatment. What? The government went to great lengths to overturn existing perceptions of prisons, such as by implementing strict sanitation standards and using white interiors to emphasize sterility. But what lay within was no less hellish than before. As ever, the government only cared about outward appearances. The government just does some weird stuff in this game for no apparent reason. It felt so pristine here, it made him shudder. Akira's bed was soaked with a powerful scent of disinfectants. More than enough to give him a headache. Somewhere out there he could hear a man with a deep voice calling for his mother. Perhaps the merciless whiteness of this room was making him hallucinate. As Akira gazed at his equally white walls, the man's voice called up a memory, like sometimes the world building in this game feels stream of consciousness. Like, no one actually thought about it beforehand. They just sort of like, oh yeah, sure, I'll just write that. Like, okay, whatever. It's like, what? No? You're not my real mom. Akira had been walking down a residential street when a child had burst from a nearby house, screaming at the top of his lungs. A woman, probably his mother, had shouted after the child, but he'd run off without sparing her a glance. Akira had only caught a short glimpse. That had been enough to see the bruises and scars covering the child's body. In the end, strangers were strangers. While it may have been different in another era, right now everything was hopelessly worn out. No one could afford to love someone who wasn't truly related to them. When you got down to it, the only person you could trust was yourself. The ponderous sound of the door sliding open cut through the din. Akira pulled himself out of his reverie. He could see a guard swaggering. The guard approached with a swagger from down the hallway. Halting in front of Akira's cell, he briefly looked inside with a scowl, then undid the lock and slid the bars open. Clearly, he'd rather be anywhere else.
出ろ。面会だ。
Is there any reason you talk like that?
面会
It's like they really asked the Japanese voice actors to can you do it really hammy? Like honestly, that is how like all the Japanese games Japanese voice acting that I've played, that's how it always is. It's just so hammy. He couldn't think of anyone else who'd come looking for him here. As he considered this, the guard impatiently jerked his chin towards the hall. Though it still didn't make any sense to him, Akira slowly forced his sore body to stand. The pure white room into which Akira was ushered resembled a bleached version of his cell. If they shut him up in a place like this, he was confident that he'd go crazy in a matter of hours. The room was divided down the middle by a thin sheet of glass with chairs set up on either side.
面会時間は10分だ。
Is there any reason you had to say that right in my ear? The guard's forbidding voice echoed off the walls. Akira's mysterious visitors were already waiting on the opposite side of the glass. A woman seated with a man standing at her side. He'd never seen either one before. At first glance, they almost didn't seem real. Everything about them was too neat, too tidy. It was like looking at a pair of life-size dolls. Too much cleavage. It's unbelievable. As Akira took his seat, the woman's narrow lips widened in a smile. Her skin was as white as wax.
国民番号
Why are the voices suddenly louder?
11298TM3099 だな。
What? Seriously, the voices are just suddenly louder. Akira had never gotten used to the lifeless numbers of the government had assigned him. He stared at the woman in silence. Meeting his eyes steadily, she opened her mouth again.
単刀直入に言おう。我々がここに来たのは他でもない。
俺じゃない
Her smile deepened.
お前の容疑が晴れる可能性はほぼゼロに等しい。
Who on earth were these two? Obviously, they weren't ordinary civilians, and considering the way they carried themselves...
自己紹介が遅れたな。私はエマ。彼はグエンだ。まあ、公にはできない立場のものとでも思ってもらえればいい。
Well, whatever that meant, it was clear they weren't here on his behalf.
話を戻そう。今言った通り、お前の容疑が晴れる可能性はほとんどない。殺人罪を犯した者の末路は知っているな。
Her tone was prodding. She was testing him. No, her tone was suggestive, prodding. She was testing him. His annoyance building up, Akira replied.
終身刑だろ
そうだ。当然、その恐ろしさも知っているな。
A life sentence. Under the new laws of this country, all murderers, regardless of circumstance, received life in prison. But what really meant was torture, state-sanctioned, that lasted until your death. Prisoners were prevented from killing themselves and were tormented in ways designed to ensure that they lasted as long as possible. Why? At times, murderers who killed people in particularly heinous ways were forced to undergo the exact same treatment they themselves had inflicted. Why? It was all to bring the rising rate of violent crime under control, or so the government claimed.
このままだと、お前は確実に終身刑となる。
俺じゃない
Akira glared at Emma, his words imbued with anger. More than he feared death or punishment, he was infuriated by this outrageous treatment. Emma lifted her chin, a gesture of contempt.
いくらここで無実を主張したところで、法廷で裁かれれば終わりだ。聞け。何もわざわざお前に最後通告をしに来たわけではない。
Emma's eyes
要
held a
件は
challenging
ここ
light.
からだ。解放してやれなくもない。ただし、こちらが提示する条件を飲めばな。
条件
国民番号 11298TM3099 ブラスター個人戦優勝者敗戦記録はなし。腕は確かなようだな。
Do you have to take such long pauses?
どいつもこいつもよっぽどブラスターが好きなんだな
He was starting to get sick of hearing about it. Emma laughed a little as response.
豊島という町のことは知っているな。
The sudden change in topic took Akira by surprise. Toshima. A district of the Old Lands, the abandoned capital metropolis where criminals gathered to flee the spreading tendrils of Reconstruction. The city's existence caused no end of trouble for both the CFC and Nichiren, but neither side was willing to let the other solve the problem. A true solution was likely impossible as long as the country remained divided.
知っているという顔だな。それならイグラの噂ぐらいは聞いたことがあるだろう。ブラスターに参加しているのならなおさらな。
イグラか。
He'd heard the rumors. Igra was an underground fighting tournament held in the lawless Toshima district. There were more than a few blaster participants who longed to enter Igra.
同じストリートファイトとはいえ、イグラはブラスターのようなお遊びではない。命をかけた真剣勝負だ。勝ち残った者はイルレの座を手に入れ、名実ともにトシマの王として君臨する。
イルレ？
トシマを拠点とする麻薬組織ヴィスキオの首領のことだ。イグラとはイルレの座をかけた争奪戦のことだ。最も強い者こそがヴィスキオを率いるにふさわしいと、あの町に群れる狂犬どもは本気でそう思っている。
ただの噂じゃなかったのか。
Street gangs are one thing, but the leader of an organization like Vishio would need brains, not just brawn. It was as plain as the noise on Akira's face that choosing their leader by strength alone would eventually lead to their downfall.
それが本当なら、ビスキオは正真正銘のバカの群れだな。
だが、ヴィスキオは我々 CFC や日光連も無視できない巨大なシンジケートとして勢力を誇っている。それがなぜか、わかるか？頂点に立つ者が不動だからだ。イグラが始まってから今日に至るまで、現役のイルレを破って新たな王座を手に入れた者はいない。
一人も？
イグラの開催者である初代のイルレが、今も腐敗の王としてヴィスキオに君臨しているということだ。裏を返せば、奴は腐敗の自信があるからこそ、王座争奪戦などという酔狂なゲームを始めたのだろうな。
Without realizing it, Akira's image of the man called Il-Rei had become a presence in his mind too great to ignore. The tournament's founder, an undefeated champion who willingly risked his life in position to lay low all the brave souls who faced him. No one would doubt the strength of a man like that.
現役のイルレは最強というカリスマ性によって組織を一つにまとめている。奴の腐敗伝説が崩れれば、組織も崩壊せざるを得ないだろう。それが
Emma paused to give Akira an icy glare.
我々の望むところでもある。
Akira had begun to connect the dots.
要するに、イルレを打ち負かしてしまうような挑戦者を探している。
その通りだ。例えば、ブラスターで連続優勝を飾るほどのストリートファイトの熟練者などは、実に有望株だろうな。
Why wouldn't you just send in like one of your own agents? This just seems so prone to failure. Like he has no he'll just say he'll go and then he'll probably just go to the other side of Japan. I don't know what side he's in right now. I think they're in the CFC now. Like they're in KFC right now, so he might go to the Nichiren side, you know? Like if you just set him free right now. Like why wouldn't he? Like I don't get it. There's no reason for him to go fight in this tournament. Even if you set him free to go fight in it, he's just going to go to the other side of Japan. I would. Like, he has no ties of allegiance to you. Why would you not just send in your own agent? This makes no sense. Whatever. It was obvious by now what condition he would need to meet in order to get his murder charge dropped. The icy-eyed woman wanted him to enter Igra to join the Festival of Slaughter and fight his way to the top.
あんたたち、国か警察かそっち側の人間だろ？いいのか？未来を担う若者を殺し合いに駆り立てて。
In response, Emma laughed scornfully.
無期懲役囚が担う未来などない。それに、お前の知る意味での警察とも我々は違う。我々は治安を維持するのではなく、治安の障害を排除する役目を負った人間だ。
Indeed, the detectives who questioned Akira had an entirely different aura than the two currently in front of him. Those two look like the sort of people who treated people's lives as if they were numbers on a balance sheet.
これまでにも数回にわたってビスキオに侵入しイルレを暗殺する作戦が実行されたが、
You guys just
その
suck.
全てが失敗に終わっている。
Just get a gun.
イルレの守りは鉄壁だ。奴に近づくどころか正体をつかむことさえ叶わなかった。奴はイグラの決勝戦でしか姿を現さない。奴と接触し仕留める機会があるとすればそこしかない。
また随分必死だな。
豊島から CFC に流出している麻薬の量を知っているか。ビスキオは我々にとって目に余るほど大きな海だ。
So they saw themselves as serving the greater good, all without getting their own hands dirty.
俺がイルレを倒したとして、もし新しいイルレが現れたら
But wouldn't you be the new Ilray? You defeated him. Wasn't that the whole point? Emma's eyes fixed on Emma's expressionless face. Akira questioned her with a challenge in his voice.
もしかしたら俺が2代目のイルレになってまた麻薬を流出させるかもしれない。豊島だけでなく
Emma was not impressed. Oh. She laughed harshly, eyes staring down at him as if he were a worm.
お前が富や権力のためにリーダーシップを発揮するというのか。面白い。お前についてのプロファイリングは全て検証済みだ。群れでの行動は嫌いだろう。
Bullseye. He loathed the aggravation that came with leading a group. He had no interest in being a drug king, nor working for the government. But what he wanted even less than that was to rot away behind bars without ever clearing his name. And then there was Igra, a fight to the death. Not safe like Blaster. The Blaster's not safe. The victor would earn awe-inspiring renown, and the loser would pay for his weakness with his life.
選ぶ権利はお前にある。強制はしない。
Emma watched Akira with the eyes of a falcon fixed on its prey. Slowly, Akira felt an emotion rise to fill his mind. It wasn't fear. It was a kind of determination, similar to curiosity or a wish long denied, which brought with it a quiet exhilaration. Igra would be the ultimate battle, the one where Akira could give his all. He could fight until his life had been whittled to the bone. He had always wondered what would happen when his flesh reached its limit. His military training had taught him both how to kill and how to die, but that was all just a theory. The war had ended before he could truly test himself. The void that not even Blaster could fill. Perhaps Igra might offer something to silence this gnawing emptiness. Either way, his life would be over the moment he turned down Emma's proposal. All that would await him then was a suffocating cell and the endless grind of torture. They would wear his body and heart down to nothing until he returned to the nameless dust that had birthed him. If he accepted her offer and succeeded, he would be free to go, cleared of suspicion. Akira didn't need to weigh the options to know his answer. He slowly lifted his head to face the woman who was, for this one moment, his savior. He nodded without a word. Emma replied with an arresting smile.
成立だ。
それでは麻薬組織ビスキオとイグラについて簡単に説明させてもらう。
Togainu had kept silent the entire time and suddenly opened his mouth.
まずイグラのルールについて説明する。重火器の使用は禁止、殺人は可。先に背中が地面についたものを敗者とする。また一度参加したら棄権することはできない。
I'd bring a gun anyway. You can't say anything if I bring a gun when the rules are you can't bring a gun. I'll just shoot you. It's like, come on now.
参加方法はイグラを取り締まるアルビトロへ直接希望を伝えて参加証となるタグを受け取る。タグは5枚1組。どれか1枚を必ず首から下げておかなければならない。他4枚は所持さえしていればよい。タグにはトランプと同じ数字と記号が割り当てられている。決められた種類のタグを5枚集めてアルビトロへ申請することでイルレへの挑戦権を獲得することができる。いつでも挑めるというわけではない。
The way he laid it out so smoothly, voiced, attached, and businesslike, actually made it harder to understand. Akira gave him a silent shrug.
要するに銃を使わず地面に背中をつけずタグを1枚首から下げ5種類のタグを集めればいい。
イルレイの挑戦権を獲得するために集めるタグの種類は？
ポーカーと似たようなものだ。ロイヤルストレートと10以上のフルハウス。数とは関係ないが、それ以外は何を揃えても無効だ。
That meant either a group made up of a 10, a jack, a queen, a king, and an ace, or a set containing 3 tags of one rank and 2 of another, all 10 or higher.
面倒だな。
実際にはそれほどでもないだろう。烏合の衆にも通じるルールだからな。
出発は明日。武器、参加賞など必要なものはこちらで用意しておく。それまで自宅待機。監視をつけさせてもらう。
監視？
念のためだ。それに明日以降の手順についても連中に聞くといい。話は以上だ。何か質問は？
Leaning back in his chair, Akira regarded Emma expressionlessly.
不満なら。
Emma turned and slowly rose to her feet.
それでは健闘を祈る。
As she was about to leave, Emma looked over her shoulder and twisted her lips into a vicious grin. Akira cared little about people's appearances, but even he thought this expression suited her better than any other. Huh. Akira wasn't sure what he'd imagined they'd mentioned keeping an eye on him, but Akira wasn't sure what he'd imagined when they mentioned keeping an eye on him, but certainly nothing as ostentatious as this. A pair of black men in suits had been trailing after him ever since he left police custody. Their grim, tight-wound demeanor went quite at odds with Akira's casual getup, and he found himself getting greatly discomforted by the looks passerbyers kept giving them. It felt like being in a bad film. He hurried home, unable to withstand much more of it. By the time he reached the building, the sky was shifting to a deep blue hue. He went down the hall to his apartment, and was about to stick the key in the door when he sensed them behind him and looked over his shoulder.
どこまでついてくるつもりだ。
無駄口を叩くな。
His attitude was as haughty as his getup. Akira heaved a sigh.
アキラ。
Oh. At the sound of his name, Akira lowered his key and turned around. Has he just been lying on the floor the whole time? Since he got punched or thrown off or whatever? A figure in blue coveralls, Keisuke, was running towards him, panting. Once he reached Akira's side, he stopped and doubled over, shoulders heaving as he gasped.
アキラ、よかった。戻ってこなかったら警察に乗り込もうかと。
お前、ずっとここで待ってたのか？
It had been quite a while since the cops had hauled him off.
心配だったし、アキラ戻ってくるなら真っ先にここだろうと思って。
One of the suited men stepped forward, interrupting him. He stood between Akira and Keisuke like a wall.
不必要な接触は避けてもらおうか。
なんだよ、あんた。
お前に知る権利はない。
どけよ。
Keisuke tried to shove him out of the way, but the man didn't budge.
邪魔をするな。
The other man reached out to seize Keisuke.
それはこっちのセリフだ。
The two men turned at the sound of Akira's voice. Their movements were nearly identical.
これが最後になるかもしれないんだ。別れを惜しむくらいいいだろ。
He emphasized those final words. The suited men considered this for a moment. Finally, one of them muttered an answer.
10分だけだ。
わかった。ケイスケ。
Why do you care how much fluid I exchange with this man? Please, be gone. His reply perfunctory, Akira exchanged looks with Casey and unlocked the door. He was about to enter the room when a callous hand grabbed him by the shoulder.
待て。話だけならここでもできるだろう。
Annoyed, Akira shook the hand off and slowly turned around. Then he seized Casey's arm, pulled him closer, and draped an arm over his shoulder.
ここじゃちょっとできないようなことをしたい仲なんで。
The men
行こ
froze.
う、ケイスケ。
Even Akira himself thought that was a convincing act. It wasn't. It was amusing to see those cops at a loss. I mean, maybe Keisuke makes it convincing alone. Because he's a simp. Akira closed the door slowly, dragging Keisuke, who was even more shocked than the cops inside. Alright, well, I think I'm gonna end this episode here, guys, right before we presumably have to keep up appearances and F the life out of Keisuke to make those cops not get suspicious. Oops, I skipped a line. But, yeah. I look forward to playing the next video with you guys. Until then, bye.